September 15, 1940. The skies above Kent, England. A formation of supermarine Spitfires banks hard into a tightening turn, and the German Messerschmitt Bf 109s chasing them cannot follow, their own wings simply unable to match the impossibly tight arc the British fighters are carving through the autumn sky. The engagement unfolds thousands of feet above the patchwork fields and church spires of Kent, contrails scrawling white arcs across a sky already crowded with the drone of hundreds of engines, the roar of 8 machine guns raking through a German fighter's fuselage, momentarily overpowering even that constant, droning backdrop before the Spitfire pilot breaks away, searching the sky for the next threat. The wing making that turn possible looks, to the untrained eye, almost extravagantly impractical. Thin, curved, and elliptical rather than straight-edged, the Spitfire's wing had been dismissed by engineers elsewhere in the aviation industry as an unnecessary complication, a shape that added enormous manufacturing difficulty for aerodynamic gains, most designers considered marginal at best. Aeronautical engineers working on rival aircraft throughout the 1930s frequently pointed to the elliptical wing's compound curvature as an almost absurd extravagance, a shape that theoretical aerodynamics textbooks praised for its lift distribution properties, but that practical production engineers considered a needless indulgence when simpler, straight-tapered wings could achieve nearly comparable performance at a fraction of the manufacturing cost and complexity. British aircraft manufacturers competing for Air Ministry contracts in the years before the war had largely abandoned elliptical wing designs in favor of simpler, straight-tapered shapes that were dramatically cheaper and faster to produce. Sidney Cam's design for the Hawker Hurricane, entering production alongside the Spitfire and destined to shoulder the greater share of Fighter Command's total combat sorties throughout the Battle of Britain, exemplifies exactly this pragmatic engineering philosophy. Its simpler wing structure, allowing faster production rates and easier repair of battle damage, even as its aerodynamic performance, while entirely respectable, never quite matched the tighter turning capability Mitchell's more complicated design would ultimately deliver. Yet on this September morning, as the Royal Air Force fights for its survival against the numerically superior Luftwaffe, that supposedly impractical wing is proving to be the single most decisive design decision of the entire aircraft. The difference between British pilots surviving to fight another day and being run down by faster, more numerous German fighters over their own homeland. Fighter Command's pilots, many of them barely out of flight training and thrown into combat against battle-hardened German aviators with years of experience from the Spanish Civil War and the campaigns in Poland and France, depend on exactly the kind of forgiving, tight-turning handling characteristics that Mitchell's wing design provides. A margin of maneuverability that, in the hands of even a relatively inexperienced pilot, could mean the difference between surviving an engagement and becoming another entry in the mounting casualty lists both air forces are compiling with grim regularity throughout that long, desperate summer. To understand why this one design choice carries such enormous weight, you have to understand the man who made it, and the desperate calculations British aviation faced in the years leading up to the Battle of Britain. Reginald Joseph Mitchell, chief designer at Supermarine Aviation Works, had spent much of his career designing racing seaplanes for the Schneider Trophy competition, high-speed aircraft whose success depended on squeezing every possible ounce of aerodynamic efficiency from a wing shape optimized for minimum drag at high speed. Mitchell's Schneider Trophy races, culminating in the Supermarine S-6B that captured the trophy permanently for Britain in 1931 and subsequently set a new world airspeed record, had already demonstrated Mitchell's willingness to pursue unconventional, technically demanding solutions when the performance benefits justified the additional engineering complexity. An approach to aircraft design that would carry directly through into his work on what eventually became the Spitfire. When the British Air Ministry issued specifications in the early 1930s calling for a new generation of fast, heavily armed monoplane fighters to counter the emerging threat of German rearmament, Mitchell began work on what would eventually become the Spitfire, drawing directly on the aerodynamic lessons his Schneider Trophy races had taught him about wing shape and airflow. Air Ministry Specification F. 37/34. Issued in 1934 following an earlier, less successful Supermarine submission that Mitchell had substantially reworked. Called explicitly for a fighter capable of speeds and firepower well beyond anything the Royal Air Force had previously fielded. A requirement that pushed Mitchell's design team toward exactly the kind of aggressive aerodynamic optimization that had defined his earlier racing seaplane work. Mitchell's design team, working through 1934 and 1935 at Supermarine's facilities in Southampton, settles on an elliptical wing planform, specifically because of a mathematical property well understood by aerodynamicists of the era, but exceptionally difficult to actually manufacture. An elliptical wing produces the most even distribution of lift across its entire span of any practical wing shape, minimizing the kind of drag-inducing turbulence that concentrates at the wingtips of more conventionally shaped wings. Beverly Shenstone, the aerodynamicist working most closely with Mitchell on the wing's precise mathematical form, draws on theoretical work by German aerodynamicist Ludwig Prandtl regarding ideal lift distribution, translating abstract mathematical principles into a physical wing shape that could actually be built and flown, a collaboration between theoretical aerodynamics and practical engineering that would prove decisive in giving the finished aircraft its distinctive handling characteristics. This even lift distribution allows Mitchell's design team to build a wing thin enough to minimize drag at the high speeds the Spitfire is intended to achieve, while still providing enough structural depth to house the retractable undercarriage, fuel, and eventually the concentrated battery of machine guns and cannon the aircraft would need to carry into combat. The wing's thinness, a direct consequence of the elliptical shape's efficient lift generation, allows the Spitfire to achieve top speeds exceeding 350 miles per hour in later variants, a performance figure that would have been considerably more difficult to reach, with a thicker wing generating comparable lift through less aerodynamically refined means. The manufacturing challenged this elegant aerodynamic benefit itself. Unlike the straight, tapered wings favored by rival designs like the Hawker Hurricane, which could be built using relatively simple jigs and repeated identical structural components along much of their span, the Spitfire's elliptical wing requires compound curves that change shape continuously from wing root to wing tip, demanding skilled labor and complex tooling that dramatically slows production compared to simpler alternatives. Every wing rib along the Spitfire's span differs slightly in shape from its neighbors, requiring individually crafted templates and painstaking hand-fitting during assembly, a manufacturing reality that stands in stark contrast to the interchangeable, mass-production-friendly components that characterized most other contemporary fighter designs across every major air force of the era. Supermarine's production engineers, and later the network of subcontractors and shadow factories that Britain's wartime aircraft industry expands to include, wrestle throughout the late 1930s with exactly how to manufacture this famously difficult wing shape at the volume and speed a coming war will demand. Early production estimates for the Spitfire proved badly optimistic, initial deliveries falling well behind the Air Ministry's original timetable as Supermarine's workforce and its subcontractors slowly developed the specialized skills and tooling the wing's complex geometry demands. Delays serious enough that some within the Air Ministry briefly questioned whether the Spitfire's production challenges might ultimately force a reduction in planned orders in favor of the more easily manufactured Hurricane. By the summer of 1940, with the Battle of Britain now raging in the skies over southern England, the question of whether Mitchell's elegant but complicated wing design was worth the manufacturing headache it created has moved from an abstract engineering debate into a matter of immediate, life-or-death consequence for the young pilots strapped into Spitfire cockpits every single day. Aircraft production statistics from this period tell their own story of the manufacturing challenge finally being overcome under the extreme pressure of wartime necessity. Lord Beaverbrook's Ministry of Aircraft Production driving a dramatic acceleration in Spitfire output throughout the summer of 1940 through a combination of expanded subcontracting, improved tooling, and the kind of urgent all-hands mobilization of British industrial capacity that only the direct threat of invasion could realistically produce. Beaverbrook's famously ruthless approach to boosting production, which included appeals to civilians to donate household aluminum for aircraft manufacturing, and relentless pressure on factory managers to exceed even their most optimistic output targets, transformed Spitfire production from a persistent bottleneck into a steadily improving pipeline, just as fighter command's need for replacement aircraft reaches its most acute point of the entire battle. Does the aerodynamic advantage this useless, overly complicated wing provides actually translate into the kind of combat superiority that could turn the tide of the entire battle? Or has Britain sacrificed precious production capacity, chasing an aerodynamic refinement that matters less in the brutal reality of aerial combat than it did on Mitchell's drawing board? Fighter Command's own senior officers, watching their pilots return from increasingly desperate daily engagements against a numerically superior Luftwaffe, need an answer to this question with an urgency that no peacetime engineering debate could ever have produced. Every additional Spitfire that reaches an operational squadron, representing a direct, measurable addition to Britain's capacity to contest control of its own skies. By the time the Battle of Britain reaches its climactic phase in the late summer and early autumn of 1940, the Spitfire's elliptical wing has already proven itself in combat against the Luftwaffe's own frontline fighter, the Messerschmitt Bf 109, in ways that validate every difficult manufacturing decision Mitchell's design had demanded years earlier. Ground crews servicing Spitfires between sorties, working in makeshift conditions under the constant threat of German bombing raids against Fighter Command's own airfields, come to know the aircraft's demanding wing intimately, patching battle damage to compound curves that resist the kind of quick, improvised repairs simpler wing designs might allow, an unglamorous burden shared by the mechanics and riggers whose own skill and endurance kept the elliptical wing's tactical advantage, flying day after exhausting day throughout the entire campaign. Combat reports flowing back to Fighter Command headquarters throughout July and August 1940 increasingly note a consistent pattern in engagements between Spitfires and Bf 109s. British pilots repeatedly able to outturn pursuing German fighters, even when outnumbered or bounced from a position of initial disadvantage, a pattern too consistent across too many individual squadrons to attribute to pilot skill alone. Royal Air Force Fighter Command, under the overall direction of Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, has organized its defense of British airspace around a network of radar stations, ground observers, and rapidly scrambled fighter squadrons that depend on aircraft capable of climbing quickly to intercept incoming German raids and then outturning and outfighting the escorting Bf 109s once combat is joined. Dowding's entire defensive system, later recognized by military historians as one of the most sophisticated integrated air defense networks assembled by any nation to that point in history, depends fundamentally on the assumption that once British fighters reach an incoming German formation, they possess a genuine tactical edge capable of inflicting disproportionate losses on the attacking force, an assumption the Spitfire's turning performance helps validate engagement after engagement throughout the battle's most intense weeks. The Bf 109, flown by pilots of Luftflotte 2 and Luftflotte 3 under the overall command of Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, represents a formidable adversary in its own right, faster in a dive than the Spitfire and equipped with fuel injection that allows German pilots to push their aircraft into negative G maneuvers without the engine cutting out, a persistent vulnerability in early Spitfire variants. German pilots, many of them combat veterans of the Spanish Civil War's Condor Legion and the swift campaigns across Poland and France earlier in 1940, bring a level of accumulated combat experience that, in the war's opening year, considerably exceeded what most of their British counterparts, thrown into the desperate defense of their homeland after only limited operational flying, could yet claim for themselves. This experience gap narrows steadily as the battle wears on, British squadrons gaining precisely the kind of hard-won combat seasoning that only sustained operations against a determined enemy can provide. A leveling process that, combined with the Spitfire's own consistent aerodynamic edge, gradually erodes whatever advantage German pilot experience had initially conferred. Yet in the sustained, turning dogfights that increasingly characterize combat over southern England throughout August and September 1940, the Spitfire's elliptical wing delivers an advantage that consistently overrides these German technical strengths. A dramatically tighter turning radius, allowing Spitfire pilots to pull inside a pursuing Bf-109's turn and reverse the tactical situation from hunted to hunter within a matter of seconds. This turning advantage proves particularly decisive in exactly the kind of desperate, close-quarters engagements that dominate the battle's most intense phases, when formations break apart into dozens of individual duels scattered across miles of sky, each pilot fighting essentially alone against whatever enemy aircraft happens to cross his path. Circumstances where the Spitfire's inherent maneuverability advantage could not be neutralized by superior German numbers or coordinated tactics. On September 15, 1940, a date that will come to be remembered as Battle of Britain Day for the scale and intensity of the fighting, Fighter Command commits nearly every available squadron to intercept two massive waves of German bombers and escorting fighters pushing toward London. A battle involving hundreds of aircraft on both sides across the skies of Kent, Surrey, and the approaches to the British capital. Radar operators at chain-home stations along the southern coast track the incoming German formations building over France from early morning, giving Fighter Command controllers precious additional minutes to scramble squadrons and vector them toward intercept points. Exactly the kind of coordinated, information-driven defense that Dowding's integrated system had been specifically designed to enable against a raid of this unprecedented scale. Squadron leader Douglas Bader, leading the famous Big Wing formation of 5 squadrons scrambled from bases north of London, brings dozens of Spitfires and Hurricanes into the fight in a mass formation intended to overwhelm German bomber formations before they can reach their targets. Exactly the kind of large-scale engagement where the Spitfire's turning performance proves repeatedly decisive against escorting German fighters attempting to protect their bombers. Bader himself, flying despite having lost both legs in a pre-war flying accident, embodies exactly the kind of determined, aggressive leadership that Fighter Command's pilots draw inspiration from throughout the battle's most desperate weeks. His big-wing tactics remaining controversial among some fellow commanders, even as the sheer scale of aircraft he brings to bear on September 15th produces genuinely significant results against the German formations his squadrons intercept. Individual combat reports from pilots flying that day describe engagements unfolding in a pattern that has, by this stage of the battle, become almost a signature of Spitfire versus Bf-109 combat. A Spitfire pilot, finding himself with a German fighter on his tail, hauls the control column back and stamps on the rudder, pulling his aircraft into a turn so tight that the pursuing Bf-109, unable to match the radius without stalling or blacking out its own pilot under the accumulating G-forces, is forced to either break off the pursuit entirely or overshoot, presenting the Spitfire pilot with exactly the kind of fleeting opportunity a skilled aviator needs to reverse the engagement and bring his own guns to bear. Pilots surviving these engagements often describe the physical sensation of the maneuver in visceral terms decades later, the crushing weight of accumulated G-forces pressing them deep into their seats, vision narrowing to a grey tunnel at the turn's most extreme point, blood draining from the head as the aircraft claws through a radius that would tear a lesser wing apart, or simply exceed the stall margin any less refined aerodynamic design could safely provide. This single tactical dynamic, repeated across hundreds of individual dogfights throughout the Battle of Britain, owes its existence directly to the aerodynamic properties of Mitchell's elliptical wing, a shape that allows the Spitfire to generate more lift at lower speeds without stalling than the Bf-109's more conventional wing design permits. Aeronautical analysis conducted both during and after the war consistently confirms that the elliptical planform's superior lift distribution translates directly into a lower stall speed and correspondingly tighter minimum turning radius compared to the Bf-109's straighter, more conventionally shaped wing, a quantifiable aerodynamic advantage that underlies every one of the countless individual engagements where British pilots managed to outturn their German pursuers throughout the battle's 4-month duration. Wind tunnel testing conducted by British aeronautical researchers both before and during the war repeatedly confirms the specific numerical margin this advantage represents. Data that, while never fully public knowledge to the ordinary pilots who benefited from it in combat, provides the scientific foundation underlying every one of the tactical advantages fighter commands' aircrews came to rely upon instinctively through hard-won combat experience alone. The moment of genuine crisis for this tactical advantage arrives when German pilots, learning through hard experience that turning fights with Spitfires consistently favor the British aircraft, begin adapting their own tactics, specifically to avoid exactly this kind of engagement. Adolf Galland and Werner Mulders, two of the Luftwaffe's most respected fighter leaders and tacticians, both recognize independently, through their own combat experience and mounting squadron loss reports, that engaging Spitfires in sustained turning fights represents a losing proposition for German pilots, regardless of individual skill, prompting both commanders to advocate urgently for revised tactics that would deny British fighters the specific type of engagement where their aerodynamic advantage mattered most. Both men, already among the most successful and most respected fighter pilots in the entire Luftwaffe by the summer of 1940, carry enough personal authority within the German fighter force to push these tactical revisions through, despite some institutional resistance from more conservative senior officers still wedded to pre-war doctrine that had rarely anticipated facing an opponent whose aircraft possessed such a specific, difficult-to-counter aerodynamic advantage. Luftwaffe fighter doctrine increasingly emphasizes diving attacks from altitude, striking quickly, and then using the Bf-109's superior diving speed to disengage before a sustained turning fight can develop, a tactical adjustment that threatens to neutralize the Spitfire's single greatest advantage by simply refusing to fight the kind of battle where that advantage matters most. This revised German approach, sometimes described by frustrated British pilots as maddeningly evasive, reflects a genuine tactical sophistication on the part of Luftwaffe commanders who, despite their aircraft's real disadvantage in sustained turning combat, retain a clear-eyed understanding that avoiding an opponent's greatest strength represents sound tactical doctrine, regardless of how it might appear to pilots eager for a more direct, conclusive confrontation. British pilots describing these frustrating engagements in post-war interviews and memoirs recall the particular vexation of chasing German fighters that simply refused to fight on anything but their own preferred terms, diving away at the first sign of a developing turning contest and forcing British squadrons to adapt their entire approach to intercepting incoming raids rather than relying on the straightforward tactical superiority that had characterized the battle's earlier weeks. For a genuinely uncertain stretch of the battle's most intense weeks, it remains unclear whether British fighter tactics can adapt quickly enough to counter this German adjustment. Fighter command's own pilots and commanders debating urgently how to force German fighters into the turning engagements, where Spitfire pilots hold every advantage, rather than allowing the Luftwaffe to dictate a hit-and-run style of combat that plays instead to the Bf-109's own genuine strengths in speed and diving performance. Squadron commanders across multiple fighter command groups exchange tactical notes and after-action assessments through this critical period, gradually converging on approaches that emphasize maintaining altitude advantage where possible, and concentrating formations in ways that could threaten German fighters attempting hit-and-run passes with the prospect of finding themselves outnumbered and drawn into exactly the sustained engagement they were trying to avoid. Fighter Command Headquarters circulates these evolving tactical lessons across squadrons with a speed and consistency that reflects the organization's broader institutional flexibility, a willingness to rapidly incorporate frontline feedback into standing doctrine that stands in useful contrast to the more rigid command structures some historians have identified as constraining the Luftwaffe's own capacity for tactical adaptation during the same critical weeks. Squadron commanders begin emphasizing different formation tactics and altitude discipline specifically designed to deny German fighters the clean diving passes. Their revised doctrine depends upon forcing engagements into exactly the sustained close-quarters maneuvering, where Mitchell's wing design continues to deliver its decisive edge. By late September and into October 1940, these tactical adjustments, combined with mounting German losses among experienced fighter pilots that no amount of tactical caution could fully prevent, gradually restore something closer to the earlier pattern of engagement that had so consistently favored British pilots throughout the battle's opening weeks, even as the character of the fighting itself continues shifting in response to each side's evolving countermeasures. By the time the Battle of Britain concludes in late October 1940, with the Luftwaffe having failed to achieve the air superiority Hitler's planned invasion of Britain, Operation Sea Lion, required as an essential precondition, the Spitfire's contribution to that outcome has become inseparable from the specific aerodynamic properties of Mitchell's elliptical wing. Hitler, having repeatedly postponed the invasion timetable throughout September, as Luftwaffe losses continued mounting without achieving the decisive air superiority his planners had promised, ultimately shelves Operation Sea Lion indefinitely by mid-October. A decision that, while never publicly framed by German high command as a direct admission of defeat, nonetheless represents an unmistakable acknowledgement that the RAF Fighter Command Dowding had built flying aircraft whose aerodynamic properties German planners had consistently underestimated, had denied Germany the one precondition its entire invasion plan absolutely required. Royal Air Force Fighter Command loses hundreds of aircraft and pilots across the battle's 4-month duration, losses that, while genuinely severe, remain sustainable given Britain's aircraft production capacity and pilot training pipeline in a way that the Luftwaffe's own mounting losses, particularly among experienced fighter pilots increasingly difficult to replace, ultimately are not. Approximately 544 RAF fighter pilots lose their lives during the battle's official duration, a toll that, while representing a devastating loss for the close-knit squadrons that absorbed it, never approaches the kind of catastrophic depletion that would have forced Fighter Command to abandon the defense of British airspace entirely. A resilience owed in significant part to the steady flow of newly built Spitfires and Hurricanes reaching operational squadrons throughout the battle, despite the ongoing manufacturing challenges Mitchell's wing design continued to present. German losses across the battle exceed 1,800 aircraft, a toll that includes a disproportionate number of Bf-109s lost in exactly the kind of sustained turning engagements where the Spitfire's wing design gave British pilots their most consistent tactical edge. Luftwaffe fighter squadrons, already stretched thin by the demands of escorting bomber formations across the entire duration of daylight raids deep into hostile airspace, find their available pool of combat-ready pilots and aircraft eroding steadily throughout the battle's final weeks. A war of attrition that, however costly for Fighter Command in absolute terms, ultimately favors the defender operating over its own territory, with the full weight of domestic aircraft production behind it. The strategic consequences of this outcome extend far beyond the immediate tactical statistics of the battle itself. Hitler's failure to achieve the air superiority Operation Sea Lion required forces the indefinite postponement and eventual permanent abandonment of any German invasion of the British Isles, preserving Britain as an intact base for the eventual Allied buildup that will, 4 years later, launch the invasion of Normandy from precisely the ports and airfields that a successful German invasion in 1940 would have denied. Every subsequent chapter of the Western Allied war effort against Germany, from the strategic bombing campaign launched from British airfields to the eventual buildup of American forces preparing for D-Day, depends fundamentally on Britain remaining an unconquered, secure staging ground, a strategic reality that traces its origin directly back to the outcome German pilots and their commanders were forced to accept over the skies of Kent and Sussex in the autumn of 1940. Winston Churchill's own famous tribute to the pilots of Fighter Command, delivered before the House of Commons in August 1940, and immortalizing the phrase, "Never was so much owed by so many to so few," reflects a recognition, even in the midst of the battle itself, that the outcome of this specific aerial campaign carried consequences reaching far beyond the immediate skies over southern England. Churchill's words, delivered at a moment when the battle's ultimate outcome remained genuinely uncertain, capture something that would only become fully clear in hindsight: that the young pilots climbing into their Spitfires and Hurricanes each morning that summer were not merely defending a stretch of English countryside, but determining whether the entire architecture of the eventual Allied victory in Europe would ever have the secure, unconquered base from which to be built. For Mitchell himself, the vindication of his elliptical wing design arrives posthumously, the designer having died of cancer in June 1937. More than 3 years before his creation would prove its worth in the skies over Kent and Sussex. Mitchell, diagnosed with the illness that would eventually claim his life, even as he continued working on the Spitfire's development through its earliest test flights, never has the opportunity to witness the aircraft's full evolution into the war-winning fighter it would become. His final months of work on the design conducted with a personal urgency that colleagues later described as reflecting his own awareness that time remained short for him to see the project through to its conclusion. Mitchell never lived to see a single Spitfire fly in combat, let alone witness the aircraft's decisive contribution to Britain's survival during its most perilous summer of the entire war. A bittersweet irony that historians and aviation enthusiasts have noted for decades since as one of the more poignant footnotes to the Spitfire's legendary combat record. Joseph Smith, who succeeded Mitchell as chief designer at Supermarine, oversees the aircraft's continued development throughout the war. The fundamental elliptical wing planform Mitchell had insisted upon remaining a constant, even as engine power, armament, and countless other aspects of the design evolved dramatically across successive Spitfire variants produced through 1945. Smith's own contribution to the aircraft's wartime success, often overshadowed in popular memory by Mitchell's more celebrated legacy as the original designer, involves the difficult, unglamorous work of continuously adapting an already mature airframe to accommodate increasingly powerful Rolls-Royce Merlin and later Griffon engines, heavier armament, and the countless incremental improvements that kept the Spitfire competitive against evolving German fighter designs throughout the remainder of the war. The manufacturing challenges that had made the elliptical wing so controversial in the years before the war never fully disappear. Supermarine and its network of subcontractors continuing to grapple with the wing's demanding compound curves throughout the entire production run. Yet British industry ultimately proves capable of scaling production to meet wartime demand despite this persistent difficulty. More than 20,000 Spitfires eventually built across the war's duration, a testament to British manufacturing's ability to absorb complexity when the resulting aircraft's combat performance justified the additional cost and effort. Factories across Britain, from the original Supermarine works in Southampton to the massive Shadow factory established at Castle Bromwich specifically to expand Spitfire production capacity, gradually developed the specialized workforce and tooling necessary to produce the demanding elliptical wing at a scale that would have seemed almost impossibly ambitious to the engineers who first wrestled with Mitchell's design in the mid-1930s. Rival aircraft designers, both in Britain and among Allied nations observing the Spitfire's combat record, take careful note of exactly what Mitchell's supposedly impractical wing shape had delivered in actual combat, influencing fighter design philosophy across the remainder of the war, even as most designers ultimately conclude that the specific manufacturing costs of a true elliptical wing remain difficult to justify for aircraft not specifically optimized, as the Spitfire had been from its earliest conception, around the kind of sustained turning combat where that wing shape's advantages proved most decisive. American and Soviet aircraft designers studying captured or borrowed Spitfires and the detailed combat performance data British authorities shared with Allied governments throughout the war generally conclude that other design priorities, greater range, heavier armament, or simpler mass production characteristics, better suited their own nation's particular strategic needs, even as they acknowledged the genuine aerodynamic sophistication Mitchell's design had achieved. What the story of the Spitfire's elliptical wing ultimately reveals is a truth that extends far beyond aircraft design, or even military aviation itself, that the features most easily dismissed as impractical, expensive, or unnecessarily complicated by conventional engineering wisdom sometimes conceal the very qualities that determine survival in the moments that matter most. Engineers evaluating any new design, in any field, face a constant and genuinely difficult tension between the immediate, quantifiable costs of complexity and the harder-to-predict, sometimes decisive benefits that complexity can deliver under conditions no peacetime calculation can fully anticipate. A tension that Mitchell's own wartime experience illustrates with unusual clarity, precisely because the consequences of getting that judgment wrong proved, in the summer of 1940, measured not in budget overruns or missed deadlines, but in the survival of an entire nation. British aircraft manufacturers who abandoned elliptical wing designs in favor of cheaper, simpler alternatives were not wrong about the manufacturing costs Mitchell's design imposed. Those costs were real, persistent, and never fully solved throughout the entire production run. But they were wrong, in the most consequential way imaginable, about whether those costs were worth paying. A judgment that only the brutal, unforgiving arithmetic of actual aerial combat over Kent and Sussex in the autumn of 1940 could ultimately settle. Hawker's Hurricane, built to that more conventional, production-friendly philosophy, deserves its own considerable share of credit for the battle's outcome, shooting down more German aircraft in total than the Spitfire across the campaign's full duration, and forming the numerical backbone of Fighter Command's order of battle throughout 1940. Yet even Hurricane pilots, and the historians who study the campaign, since have consistently acknowledged that it was the Spitfire's specific aerodynamic edge in the sustained turning fights against escorting Bf-109s that freed Hurricane squadrons to concentrate more heavily on the bomber formations themselves, a division of tactical labor made possible only because Mitchell's wing gave Spitfire pilots the confidence to engage Germany's best fighters on favorable terms. The wing that engineers elsewhere called too complicated to bother with became the wing that let young pilots turn inside a pursuing enemy and live to fly again the next morning. Proof that in war, as in so much of life, the question is never simply what something costs to build, but what it costs not to. Every pilot who climbed out of his cockpit at day's end that summer, exhausted, wrung out by hours of combat and the accumulated physical toll of maneuvers that pushed both man and machine to their absolute limits, owed some measure of that survival to a decision made years earlier by a dying designer who insisted that a shape most of his contemporaries considered an indulgence was, in fact, exactly the margin his country would eventually need.